The accusation. Atlanta bustled with its usual Monday morning energy. Commuters hurried through crosswalks. Coffee shops overflowed with early risers, and the distant hum of traffic filled the air. But inside a dimly lit interrogation room at the downtown police precinct, the energy was different, heavy, tense, and laced with something sinister. At the center of it all sat Janelle Carter, a poised, elegant black woman in her mid-30s. She wore a crisp navy blue suit, her posture perfect, her face an unreadable mask of calm. Her almond brown eyes flicked between the two white officers standing before her, their expressions smug and overconfident. Detective Roy Hargrove, a burly man with graying hair and a permanent smirk, leaned against the table, arms crossed. Beside him stood Officer Daniel Wilkes, younger but just as cocky, his fingers drumming impatiently against his utility belt. "Miss Carter," Hargrove drawled, his tone thick with condescension. "You do realize the seriousness of your situation, don't you?" Janelle remained silent. She had been in rooms like this before, not as a suspect, but as an interrogator. If only they knew. Wilkes exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We've got eyewitness testimony, security footage, and an official police report saying you resisted arrest, assaulted an officer, and attempted to flee the scene of a crime." "A crime I didn't commit," Janelle replied coolly. Hargrove chuckled, shaking his head. "That's not what the evidence says." Janelle inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She knew exactly what this was. A setup, a fabricated case designed to pin something on her. Just another black woman who, in their eyes, didn't belong in their world, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. The incident. It had all started 3 nights ago at an upscale Atlanta restaurant. Janelle had been celebrating her best friend's promotion when she noticed a young black man being aggressively harassed by 2 police officers near the valet station. Their voices were low, but their intent was clear: intimidation. Janelle had spent her life fighting for justice, and she wasn't about to turn a blind eye. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officers?" Hargrove, the very same detective now sitting across from her, had turned with an irritated sneer. "Move along, lady. This doesn't concern you." "Actually," she replied, "when I see an abuse of power, it concerns me." Wilkes stepped toward her, trying to use his height to intimidate. "You interfering?" "I'm recording," Janelle had said, holding up her phone. Hargrove's expression darkened. "That's enough." What happened next was a blur. An accusation of obstruction, rough hands gripping her arms, a forceful shove to the pavement. Her phone was knocked from her grasp, the recording lost. She was arrested on the spot, charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Twisted truths. Now, sitting in the interrogation room, she listened as Hargrove and Wilkes spun their version of events. "You lunged at me," Wilkes claimed. "Tried to grab my gun." Hargrove nodded. "And when we restrained you, you kicked me in the ribs." Janelle let out a slow breath, fighting the heat rising in her chest. Lies. All of it. She had seen this playbook before. How officers like these manipulated bodycam footage, edited video to suit their narrative, and wrote reports that distorted the truth. "I see," she said evenly. "And I assume you have the footage to back this up." Hargrove smirked. "Bodycam malfunction. Unfortunate." "Really?" Janelle stared at them, her heart steady despite the injustice raging in her mind. They were so sure of themselves, so sure that she was powerless against them. If only they knew. A courtroom showdown. Within days, the case was rushed to court. The prosecution painted Janelle as an entitled troublemaker who had interfered with law enforcement. The police officers sat confidently in the witness stand, swearing under oath that Janelle had been violent, aggressive, and a threat to their safety. Wilkes, under questioning, leaned forward dramatically. "I thought she was reaching for my weapon. I feared for my life." Hargrove nodded solemnly. "We used minimal force. We were just trying to control the situation." The judge, an older white man with a stern face, listened intently. The jury, predominantly white, shifted in their seats, weighing every word. Janelle's defense attorney, Marcus Evans, a sharp-minded lawyer with a reputation for exposing corruption, turned to her. "Ready," he whispered. She gave him a small nod. As she stood, a hush fell over the courtroom. Janelle walked to the witness stand with grace, adjusting the microphone before speaking. "Detective Hargrove," she began, her voice smooth, "you said I resisted arrest violently." "Correct," Hargrove replied. "And you claim I attempted to grab Officer Wilkes' firearm?" "Yes." Janelle turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I present a piece of evidence?" The judge nodded. "Proceed." Janelle reached into her bag, pulling out a black leather wallet. She flipped it open and held it up for all to see. A golden badge gleamed under the courtroom lights. Gasps rippled through the audience. Even the judge's expression flickered with surprise. The words etched on the badge were unmistakable. Central Intelligence Agency. The room fell into absolute silence. Hargrove's face paled. Wilkes stiffened in his chair, hands clenched on the table. Janelle set the badge down in front of her. "My name is Special Agent Janelle Carter, and I hold a top-level security clearance with the CIA." She turned to the judge. "I have spent over a decade investigating corruption, international crime, and most relevant to this case, police misconduct." A stunned murmur spread through the courtroom. Janelle looked back at Hargrove and Wilkes, her voice calm but cutting. "And gentlemen, I am very, very familiar with how easily bodycam footage can be tampered with." Hargrove's jaw tightened. Wilkes shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Janelle continued, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I request that an independent forensic team be allowed to examine the original unedited security footage from the restaurant that night, because I have a strong suspicion that what we will find is the truth." The judge hesitated, then nodded. "Motion granted." Hargrove exhaled sharply, leaning in toward his lawyer. Wilkes looked visibly shaken. The game they thought they were playing was suddenly out of their control. Janelle folded her hands in front of her, unwavering. This wasn't over. Not even close. The tides turn. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The air, once thick with confidence from the two lying officers, had shifted into something much heavier, dread. Hargrove and Wilkes sat frozen, their postures rigid, their eyes flickering between each other as realization settled in. They hadn't just accused any black woman of resisting arrest. They had accused a CIA agent, a woman trained in uncovering lies, dismantling corruption, and most importantly, exposing those who abused their power. Janelle Carter sat calmly, her badge resting on the wooden witness stand like a loaded weapon. She knew what was coming next. She could feel the panic seeping into the two officers, their bodies betraying them even as they tried to mask it. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the courtroom back to focus. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice measured, but tinged with curiosity, "you're telling this court that you are a federal agent with the Central Intelligence Agency." Janelle didn't blink. "That is correct, Your Honor." Gasps rippled through the spectators. The jury members exchanged glances, the weight of the revelation dawning on them. Even the prosecutor, who had once been so confident in his case, now seemed hesitant. Judge Holloway turned his sharp gaze to the prosecutor. "Mr. Denton, given this new information, do you have any reason why we shouldn't allow an independent forensic team to analyze the surveillance footage from that night?" The prosecutor, James Denton, shifted uncomfortably. A middle-aged man with slicked-back blonde hair and a reputation for aggressive prosecution, he had built his case entirely on the word of officers Hargrove and Wilkes. Now that foundation was crumbling beneath him. "Your Honor, with all due respect," Denton began, attempting to regain control. "Agent Carter's profession is irrelevant to the facts of the case. The officers reported what they witnessed, and we have testimony that supports their version of events." Janelle tilted her head slightly, watching the prosecutor struggle. She had seen this many times before. people like Denton who were willing to look the other way when it suited them. Judge Holloway leaned forward. You don't find it relevant that the defendant holds federal clearance and specializes in uncovering corruption? Denton hesitated. With all due respect, Your Honor, that does not change the sworn testimony of these officers. Janelle turned toward Denton, her voice measured but laced with quiet power. What if that testimony is false? A murmur swept through the courtroom. Denton clenched his jaw. Janelle exhaled slowly before she spoke again. Your Honor, as part of my duties within the CIA, I have access to advanced forensic teams who specialize in recovering and authenticating video evidence. If there has been tampering, we'll find it. The judge considered this for a moment, then nodded. Motion granted. He turned to Denton. I assume the prosecution has no issue with presenting the original surveillance footage for review. Denton hesitated. That pause was everything. Janelle caught it immediately. So did the jury. So did the spectators. Judge Holloway narrowed his eyes. Mr. Denton, do I need to subpoena this evidence, or will your office provide it willingly? Denton exhaled sharply. He knew he had no choice. We will provide the footage, Your Honor. Janelle sat back, satisfied. The truth was coming. The footage tells the truth. 3 days later, the courtroom was packed again as the forensic team presented their findings. A large screen had been set up for everyone to see. Janelle sat at the defense table, her lawyer, Marcus Evans, beside her. Across the room, Hargrove and Wilkes sat with clenched jaws, their confidence from before completely shattered. A forensic expert stood at the front of the courtroom. We examined the original footage provided by the restaurant's security cameras, he began. Our findings are as follows. The lights dimmed slightly as the footage began to play. The video showed the valet area of the restaurant, the high-end establishment glowing under city lights. The young black man from that night could be seen standing near the curb, looking nervous as officers Hargrove and Wilkes approached him. The room watched in silence as the video unfolded. Janelle could be seen stepping forward, her body language calm, her phone raised as she recorded the interaction. The sound wasn't audible, but the visual was clear. Then, the moment that changed everything. Wilkes suddenly shoved Janelle backward. Gasps erupted in the courtroom. The jury leaned forward. Even the judge's brow furrowed. Wilkes had claimed she lunged at him, that she went for his gun, but the video told a very different story. Janelle had done nothing but stand her ground, until the officers attacked her. The video continued playing. It showed Hargrove knocking Janelle's phone from her hand and grabbing her arm before slamming her onto the pavement. There was no aggression from Janelle, no resisting, only brutality from the officers. Judge Holloway's face darkened as he turned to the two cops. Care to explain this? Wilkes swallowed hard. Hargrove's hands were now in fists. The forensic expert continued, his voice even. We also analyzed the body cam footage. Denton shot up from his chair. Your Honor, I must object. Judge Holloway cut him off. Sit down, Mr. Denton. Denton clenched his jaw, but did as told. The expert played the body cam footage next. There had been no malfunction. The video clearly showed Wilkes shoving Janelle, followed by Hargrove muttering, She's got it on video. We'll say she went for your gun. The courtroom exploded into shocked murmurs. Hargrove shot to his feet. This is ridiculous. Sit down, detective, the judge ordered, his tone ice-cold. Hargrove's mouth opened, then shut. He had no defense. They were caught. Justice comes swiftly. After a brief recess, Judge Holloway returned with a ruling that sent shockwaves through the city. The court finds sufficient evidence that officers Hargrove and Wilkes provided false testimony, under oath falsified reports, and engaged in unlawful force, he announced. I am ordering an immediate investigation into their actions, and I am referring this case to the Department of Justice. Janelle sat still, her heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of victory. The judge then turned his gaze to Denton. Furthermore, The prosecution's failure to properly vet its evidence will be reviewed by the state's attorney general. Denton's face paled. Finally, Judge Holloway looked at Janelle. Ms. Carter, you are fully exonerated of all charges. You are free to go. The courtroom erupted in applause. Janelle exhaled slowly. She had won. But more than that, she had set a precedent. These officers had assumed they could lie, that they could manipulate the system like they had so many times before. But this time, they chose the wrong woman. The reckoning begins. The courtroom still buzzed with energy long after the gavel struck and the judge adjourned the session. The impact of what had just happened was profound. 2 police officers, exposed as liars, their careers on the verge of collapse. But for Janelle Carter, this wasn't just about clearing her name. This was about justice. As she stepped outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved toward her, and reporters shouted questions. Agent Carter, how does it feel to have beaten the charges? What do you plan to do next? Do you think these officers will face real consequences? Janelle paused, her piercing gaze sweeping over the sea of journalists. She knew the world was watching, that this case had become bigger than just her. It had exposed a rotting foundation, a system that had protected men like Hargrove and Wilkes for far too long. She took a breath and spoke. This case isn't about me, she said firmly. It's about accountability. For too long, the truth has been buried beneath lies, and people in power have counted on those lies to shield them. That ends today. I will ensure it. The reporters pressed forward, hungry for more, but Janelle had said what she needed to. She turned on her heel, walking toward the waiting car where her longtime friend and attorney, Marcus Evans, stood. That was a strong statement, Marcus murmured as he opened the car door for her. Janelle slid inside. I meant every word. As the car pulled away from the courthouse, she stared out the window. She had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. Not even close. The officers followed. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was radioactive. Hargrove and Wilkes sat in the chief's office, their faces pale as the IA, Internal Affairs. Officers standing before them shuffle through a thick stack of papers, documents, transcripts, evidence of a pattern of misconduct. You two have been under the department's radar for a while, IA investigator Daniel Moss said, his expression unreadable. Excessive force complaints, witness intimidation, falsified reports. He placed a printed report on the desk. And now, a perjury charge hanging over your heads. Wilkes shifted uncomfortably. We were doing our jobs. Moss raised an eyebrow. Your jobs. Your bodycam footage proves otherwise. You knowingly fabricated a story to get an innocent woman convicted. But this time, you picked the wrong person to lie about. Hargrove clenched his jaw, his arrogance finally cracking. The chief, a grizzled man named Joseph Marlowe, rubbed his temples. You're both suspended indefinitely pending further investigation. If the DOJ moves forward with criminal charges, I won't lift a damn finger to stop them. This is bull. Wilkes started, but Marlowe slammed his hand down. No, this is what happens when you abuse the badge. The 2 disgraced officers were escorted out, their badges and service weapons confiscated. The department was cutting them loose. And it wasn't over yet. The FBI steps in. The next day, Janelle received an unexpected call. This is Special Agent Ethan Reynolds, FBI. The deep voice on the other end said, I'd like to meet with you regarding your case, in private. Janelle's brows furrowed. Why the FBI? Reynolds was direct. Because this goes beyond 2 corrupt cops. That was all she needed to hear. An hour later, she was sitting in a sleek, nondescript government office in downtown Atlanta. Across from her sat Reynolds, a tall, clean-cut man in his 40s, his piercing blue eyes sharp with intelligence. We've been investigating police corruption in this city for months, Reynolds said, sliding a thick file across the desk. And your case might be the missing link we needed. Janelle opened the file. Inside were dozens of reports, complaints, and sealed documents. Some she recognized, cases where officers had used excessive force or falsified reports. But others, her stomach twisted. These officers, they all have something in common, she murmured, flipping through the pages. They were all connected to Hargrove and Wilkes. Reynolds nodded. They weren't just bad cops. They were part of something much bigger. Janelle's mind raced. You're saying this was organized? Yes, and we believe they had help from inside the DA's office. Janelle's heart stopped for a second. The DA's office. Reynolds continued. Denton's resistance in court wasn't just about protecting two cops. We have reason to believe that higher-ups have been covering for officers like Hargrove and Wilkes for years. It's a network, a system designed to protect dirty cops while ruining the lives of innocent people. Janelle clenched her fists. She had suspected corruption. But this was deep-rooted rot. She looked up at Reynolds, determination burning in her eyes. What do you need from me? Reynolds smirked slightly, as if he had been waiting for that question. We need your help to take them down. The plan for justice. That night, Janelle met with Marcus in a quiet restaurant, her mind spinning with the new information. You're telling me the FBI wants you to go after the district attorney's office? Marcus asked, keeping his voice low. Janelle nodded. It's bigger than I thought. They believe Denton, along with other officials, helped cover up police misconduct for years. My case just exposed them. Marcus exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. This is dangerous, Janelle. If they've been covering for bad cops, they won't hesitate to protect themselves. If you go after them, they'll come for you. Janelle's lips pressed into a firm line. Then let them. Marcus shook his head, both impressed and worried. You don't scare easy, do you? I was trained not to, she said simply. Marcus sighed. All right. If we're doing this, we do it smart. First, we leak the truth. Janelle nodded. Agreed. The public needs to know what's happening. If we expose them before they can come after us, it weakens their power. They spent the next few hours strategizing. The plan was simple but effective. Leak the truth. Janelle would secretly provide information to trusted journalists, exposing the corruption. Follow the money. Marcus would work with FBI analysts to track financial ties between dirty cops and corrupt officials. Get a confession. If they could turn one of Denton's people against him, they'd have a solid case. As the night deepened, Janelle sat back, exhaling slowly. She had started this fight to clear her name. But now, she was about to bring down an entire empire. The storm breaks. The weight of what Janelle Carter was about to do pressed heavily against her chest. This was no longer just about clearing her name. This was about exposing an empire of corruption. Her plan with Marcus was solid. Leak the truth, follow the money, and get a confession. But Janelle knew that going after a network like this meant one thing. They would fight back. She wasn't just fighting two disgraced cops anymore. She was fighting an entire system that had spent years protecting itself. And she was running out of time. The first strike. The leak. Janelle moved quickly. Within 48 hours, she met with Amelia Stokes, an investigative journalist for the Atlanta Gazette, one of the most fearless and relentless reporters in the game. Janelle had worked with her before on intelligence matters, so she knew Amelia could be trusted. Sitting in a quiet cafe, Janelle slid a flash drive across the table. "What's this?" Amelia asked, sipping her black coffee. "Proof that the DA's office has been covering for dirty cops for years," Janelle said, her voice steady. "Financial records, internal memos, confidential reports buried by Denton himself." Amelia's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You're telling me the district attorney, the man responsible for prosecuting criminals, is actually helping them?" Janelle nodded. "And I can prove it." Amelia took the drive and pocketed it. "This is going to be huge," she said. "But you know what's coming, right? Denton isn't just going to roll over." "I'm counting on that," Janelle said. The next morning, the Atlanta Gazette's front page carried the explosive headline, Police or UPTION SCANDAL Evidencia implicates hierarching officials in COV or UPS. The article detailed the systematic corruption inside the Atlanta Police Department, linking it directly to District Attorney Brent Denton, who had helped suppress evidence and protect bad cops for over a decade. It was a nuclear bomb dropped on the city, and the fallout was immediate. The city's reaction. Social media erupted. The public had long suspected corruption, but now they had proof. Within hours, Denton's office released a weak defensive statement, calling the allegations baseless and an attempt to discredit the justice system. But it was too late. Local activists and community leaders demanded resignations. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, chanting, "We want justice. No more COV or UPS." Even politicians who had once supported Denton were distancing themselves. And then the unthinkable happened. The Georgia Attorney General announced a formal investigation into Denton's office. Janelle sat back in her apartment, watching the news coverage. Step 1 was complete. The pushback begins, but Denton wasn't going down without a fight. That afternoon, Marcus called her. "You're not going to like this," he said grimly. "What?" Denton just held a press conference. "He's flipping the script. He's calling you the criminal." Janelle's grip tightened around her phone. "On what grounds?" "He's accusing you of unlawful possession of classified information and obstructing justice. Says he's going to push for your arrest." Janelle's jaw clenched. This was retaliation. Denton was trying to make her the villain to save himself. And the worst part, he still had power. If he could convince the right people, he could actually get her arrested. "We have to move faster," Janelle said. Marcus hesitated. "I don't like where this is going, Janelle. Denton is dangerous. He's backed into a corner, and cornered animals lash out." "Then let's put him down before he gets the chance," she said coldly. They needed proof, the kind that couldn't be denied. And that meant getting someone inside Denton's circle to flip. The confession. Turning the inside man. Janelle already had a target in mind. Jonathan Pierce, Denton's deputy chief prosecutor. Pierce had worked under Denton for years. He knew everything. But more importantly, Janelle knew his secret. She and Marcus spent the next day digging into Pierce's financial records, and it didn't take long to find a weak spot. He had been accepting bribes to drop cases against dirty cops. With that leverage, Janelle set up a meeting. A quiet bar in Midtown. Pierce walked in, looking nervous as hell. "You have 5 minutes," he said, sitting across from her. Janelle slid a folder across the table. Pierce hesitated, then opened it. His face turned pale. This is proof that you've been taking bribes to protect corrupt officers," Janelle said. "Money transfers, offshore accounts, case dismissals. It's all there." Pierce swallowed hard. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Janelle leaned in. "The truth. About Denton. About everything." Pierce's fingers trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead. "I can't," he whispered. "If I talk, I'm dead." Janelle's eyes didn't waver. "If you don't talk, you're going to prison." Pierce's breathing quickened. He was trapped. And he knew it. Finally, he exhaled sharply and muttered, "All right. I'll tell you everything." The final play. The next morning, Pierce's sworn statement landed in the FBI's hands. It was the final nail in Denton's coffin. Pierce confessed to everything. The cover-ups, the bribes, the fabricated charges. And worst of all, Denton had ordered it all. By noon, the FBI issued a warrant for Brent Denton's arrest. Janelle watched the live footage as federal agents swarmed Denton's office, handcuffing him in front of stunned reporters. The mighty district attorney of Atlanta brought down by the very system he had corrupted. Justice had finally arrived. And Janelle Carter, she wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the woman who had taken the whole empire down. Justice strikes back. The walls of corruption had begun to crack, but Janelle Carter knew that taking down a powerful man like Brent Denton was just the beginning. The rot ran deep. Even with Denton in federal custody, the network of officers, prosecutors, and politicians who had protected him for years wouldn't just roll over. And if there was one thing she had learned in her years of intelligence work, it was this: a wounded beast is the most dangerous kind. The aftermath of the arrest. As Denton was led away in cuffs, the news media exploded with headlines. BRE King, NEWS. District Attorney Drarianti Dentoan, Aristi and Cor UPTION. Charges. Extilo usas IV. NSIDER, CONFES, two eras of police coavir UPs under Dention's what teach. Federal investigation LA units heed into Atlanta PD's high-gear UPS. Social media erupted. Activists flooded the streets, demanding a full sweep of corruption inside the police department and DA's office. In the span of a few hours, the city had turned into a powder keg. For Janelle, it was both a victory and a warning. Now that Denton was down, his allies would either abandon him or retaliate. She had to be ready for both. The threat no one saw coming. Janelle wasn't naive. She knew that men like Denton didn't operate alone. Which is why, when her phone buzzed late that night with an unknown number, she wasn't surprised. But when she picked up and heard the voice on the other end, her blood ran cold. "You should have walked away, Miss Carter." The voice was deep, calculated. "You think because Denton's in cuffs, this is over. You have no idea what you've done." Janelle's grip tightened on the phone. "Who is this?" A low chuckle. "That doesn't matter. What matters is that you've made a very powerful enemy. And now, we're going to make you disappear." The line went dead. Janelle immediately turned to trace the call, but it was encrypted. Whoever this was, they weren't just some petty thug. This was bigger than Denton. She had just kicked open a much darker door. And whatever was waiting on the other side, it wanted her gone. A deadly game begins. Janelle wasn't about to sit back and wait for them to come to her. She called Marcus. "We have a problem," she said. "Yeah, no kidding," he replied. "The feds just expanded their investigation. Half the police department is in panic mode." "No, Marcus. I mean, we have a real problem. Someone just called me. They knew everything. And they threatened me." Marcus's tone darkened. "Do you think it's Denton's people?" "I think it's bigger. We took down one part of the operation. But if Denton was being protected, then whoever's above him is still out there." There was silence on the line. Then, "We need to find out who's pulling the strings." Janelle nodded. She wasn't just fighting one corrupt man anymore. She was about to go head-to-head with an entire hidden empire. And if they wanted to play dirty, she was more than ready. The man in the shadows. Over the next few days, Janelle and Marcus worked nonstop, digging through everything they had. Pierce's testimony had named Denton, but it was clear there were bigger players behind him. Then, finally, a break. Through a series of bank records and anonymous offshore accounts, they found a name that no one had ever mentioned before. Graham Holloway, a former federal prosecutor turned high-powered lobbyist. On the surface, just another rich white man in a suit. But beneath that, he had been funding and protecting corrupt law enforcement officials for decades. Denton was just a puppet. Holloway was the puppet master. And the moment Janelle found his name, she realized something else. He was the one who had called her. This wasn't just about covering up Denton's crimes anymore. Holloway wanted to silence her, permanently. The trap is set. Janelle knew that taking down Holloway wouldn't be like taking down Denton. Denton had been careless. Holloway, he was a ghost. But everyone had a weakness. And Holloway's? His money. Through a combination of hacking, old contacts, and a little CIA expertise, Janelle and Marcus uncovered a massive illegal slush fund, millions of dollars hidden in offshore accounts, directly linked to payoffs for dirty cops and DA officials. They had hard evidence. Now, they just needed to make sure the right people saw it. Janelle reached out to her old friends in Washington, the kind who still owed her favors. Within 24 hours, a classified federal investigation was launched. And within 48 hours, Graham Holloway's house was raided by the FBI. It was over. The true mastermind behind the corruption in Atlanta had finally been exposed. Janelle had won. The final showdown. Janelle stood outside the federal courthouse as cameras flashed and reporters shouted. She didn't need to say much. The truth had already spoken for itself. Holloway was facing RICO charges. Denton was done. The police department was being completely overhauled. For the first time in years, Atlanta had a chance at real justice. But Janelle knew this wasn't just about one city. This was a warning. To every corrupt officer, every dirty official, every man who thought he was untouchable. Their time was up. Justice had arrived. And her name, Janelle Carter. The legacy of justice. The battle had been long. The wounds, both physical and emotional, would take time to heal. But standing outside the courthouse, Janelle Carter knew one thing for certain. She had won. Brent Denton, once an untouchable district attorney, was in prison without bail, awaiting trial on federal corruption charges. Graham Holloway, the shadowy puppet master who had controlled Atlanta's justice system from behind the scenes, had been exposed, arrested, and indicted under RICO laws. The entire Atlanta Police Department was under federal scrutiny, with dozens of officers suspended or dismissed. And the world was watching. Janelle had not just taken down a corrupt system. She had lit a fire that could not be ignored. But as much as the public cheered, she knew the truth. Justice was never truly finished. And neither was she. The fallout. Enemies in the dark. Despite the arrests and investigations, danger still lurked in the shadows. Janelle knew that when you take down powerful men, their allies don't just fade away. They regroup. They plot. They seek revenge. She had seen it happen before. Corrupt networks had roots that ran deep, and while Holloway's fall had shaken the foundation, there were still those who would rather rebuild the empire than let it crumble. And she wasn't about to let that happen. So while the world celebrated, she prepared for the next battle. Because the war was far from over. A new beginning, a new mission. 1 week after Holloway's arrest, Janelle walked into a private office in downtown Atlanta, greeted by none other than Special Agent Marcus Reed. He smirked when he saw her. "I was wondering when you'd finally show up." Janelle crossed her arms. "I had to make sure the city didn't burn down first." Marcus nodded. "Well, you did more than that. You changed everything." "Not enough," she said, her expression serious. "Denton and Holloway were big, but they weren't the only ones. We both know that." Marcus sighed, sitting back in his chair. "You're not wrong. We're still tracking offshore accounts, and we're getting more names every day. This thing runs deeper than we thought." Janelle's gaze hardened. "Then let's finish what we started." Marcus chuckled. "You sound like you want a job." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't want a job," she said. "I want a mission." Marcus looked at her for a long moment, then slid a folder across the table. Janelle picked it up, flipping it open to see a list of names, photos, and financial records. Evidence of even more corruption, spanning multiple cities, multiple states. "This is just the beginning," Marcus said. Janelle closed the folder. "Then let's get to work." 1 year later, the final reckoning. 1 year after Brent Denton and Graham Holloway were taken down, the nation had changed. Janelle's investigation, once dismissed as a political attack, had become a nationwide movement. City by city, state by state, more officials were exposed and arrested. The corrupt police officers, prosecutors, and judges who had abused their power for years were finally being held accountable. The people who had suffered in silence, falsely accused, wrongfully convicted, beaten, harassed, or ignored, finally had their voices heard. And Janelle, she had become a symbol, a name that struck fear into corrupt officials, a living reminder that no matter how powerful they thought they were never untouchable. The final showdown, a ghost from the past. But there was one final battle left to fight, because not everyone had fallen. Janelle had spent a year tracking one last ghost, one last powerful figure who had escaped justice, a man who had funded Denton and Holloway's operations, a man who had ordered her death. And now, she had finally found him. The confrontation, a face-to-face battle. It happened in a luxurious estate in Washington, D.C., a billionaire's mansion, a fortress of wealth and power. And inside, Senator Richard Alden. Janelle stood in his study, facing him across a desk made of imported Italian marble. "You've been busy," Alden said, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "You know, most people would have taken the win and walked away." Janelle smirked. "I'm not most people." Alden sipped his drink, eyes cool and calculating. "I have enough money to make this all go away," he said. "Walk away, and I'll make you the richest woman in the country." Janelle leaned forward. "I don't want your money." Alden's smile faded. "I want your confession." A long silence. Then, Alden laughed. "You're bold, I'll give you that." Janelle reached into her jacket and tossed a USB drive onto the desk. Alden's laughter stopped. "That's every offshore account, every bribe, every deal you made," she said. "You can either walk into that FBI office on your own." She pulled out her phone, tapping the screen. "Or I can press send, and every news outlet in America will have it before your next sip of whiskey." Alden's jaw clenched, his hands tightened into fists. For the first time in his life, he had lost. And he knew it. The final victory. 3 days later, Senator Alden resigned. 1 week later, he was indicted on federal corruption charges. Janelle had done the impossible. She had taken down the highest seat of power in the corrupt network that had controlled Atlanta and beyond for decades. And now, there was nothing left to fear. The war was over. The last goodbye. Janelle stood on the balcony of her apartment, looking over the Atlanta skyline. A lot had changed. And yet, one thing remained the same. She would always fight for justice. Marcus walked up beside her, handing her a glass of champagne. "You did it," he said. Janelle smiled. "No, Marcus, we did." He raised his glass. "To justice." She clinked her glass against his. "To justice." As the city lights shimmered below, Janelle Carter knew that this was not the end. Because in a world where powerful men believed they were above the law, there would always be another battle to fight, and she would always be ready.